Then we got to a point when you're seeing some of that expire, right? I mean, N95 mask, that you bought in 2022 have a 4-year shelf life, right? They're going to start expiring in 2026. There's a time when you have to be brave enough to go ahead and let some of that go and not hold on to so much.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now, it's time to roll back and start the first case.
On today's episode of First Case, we are wrapping up Season 12 with Suzi Collins, Director of Supply Chain Analytics for Banner Health. And, Chris, after the pandemic, I think all of us are acutely aware of the struggles that our friends in the supply chain faced. And we remember feeling the effects of those difficulties within our departments. Maybe we didn't have what we needed. And it's not that supply chain wasn't trying to get it, but many times those items just weren't available. And while the pandemic is a recent and somewhat extreme example, I think it's very fitting that we round out this season by discussing the many ways that disasters of all kinds, from pandemics to natural disasters to bridge collapses, any of those things can affect the availability of our supplies.
Yeah, and trust me, by the end of this episode, you're going to want to take your weather app and add Memphis, Tennessee
Absolutely.
to it. Trust us. I can't wait for everybody to hear what Suzi has to say.
Chris, you are so right. So we will answer that question. What's going on in Memphis? How do we respond in an emergency? And how do we keep those supplies moving? We'll find out when we come back with Suzi Collins.
Hi, I'm Chris Blevins.
And I'm Melanie Perry.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to First Case.
Joining us now is Suzi Collins, Director of Supply Chain Analytics for Banner Health in Phoenix, Arizona. And Suzi, thank you so much for joining us on the show today and for helping us wrap up this season on disaster preparedness.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Back in Season 8, you joined us for the first time. And on that show, we were talking about collaboration between the operating room and supply chain. And for those of you listening, if you want to check out that interview, go look for Season 8, Episode 3. That episode was Cracking the Communication Code, Optimizing OR Supply Chain Collaboration. And it was a fantastic conversation. And we really did tackle that topic and that challenge of collaborating between our two departments. But it's interesting because I think today's conversation is actually going to springboard off of that episode really well, because when a disaster occurs, working together is essential for success and for keeping operations running. But before we get too far into that topic, I want you to go ahead and introduce yourself to everyone who hasn't heard your other episode or doesn't know who you are. Why don't you just tell them a little bit about yourself?
Awesome. Thank you, Melanie. So I'm Suzi Collins. I have been in Arizona my entire life. I did have a brief stint in Albuquerque, but otherwise I've been here in beautiful Phoenix. And I've been in the acute care setting for 31 years, which is weird because I'm 36. It's so strange. I was such a smart little 5-year-old. Right? But I actually started on the vendor side, and it's really interesting because my life is full circle. I'm new with Banner, and I literally used to call on them and did a ton of work with them back in the 90s, early 2000s. And here I am coming back now as an employee, which is very surreal and very exciting. So I am truly passionate, not only about just healthcare and everything we do, but I'm extremely passionate about supply chain.
it really is your passion that comes to mind when I think about people who can speak to supply chain, people who are passionate about this area of healthcare and really can speak to the issues we have and the challenges. So when I was thinking about how can we pull supply chain into this conversation on disaster preparedness, I was like, I got to talk to Suzi. Suzi is the person we're going to talk to.
She knows it.
She does. She really does. And I think we could talk all day long about probably different disasters you've experienced too. But before we go into that, can you kind of give us an overview of maybe the supply chain department as a whole and kind of tell us what y'all are doing on a daily basis to help support other departments?
Absolutely. And it's interesting. One, I want to say, obviously, here in Phoenix, Arizona, we don't have many disasters. We actually, have reasonably good weather. Nothing crazy happens. But we are very cognizant of what's happening around the country, right? Because we have to be. So every day we're really tasked with not only getting the supplies into the clinicians' hands so they can do the cases that are on the schedule, but we also need to be watching out a week in advance, and the best run supply chain departments have materials coordinators and stuff that are working directly with their departments to look at the schedule, think about anything that might be coming in, depending on their nature. Are they a level 1 trauma center? What type of cases are they supporting? Oncology. There's so many different things that we really need to be aware of and understand what our audience is, if you will. So it's not just about opening a box and putting something in a bin. It's about really being proactive with our departments. And even to know, if we hear that Memphis is having bad weather, we may have delays with FedEx, but we also know Dr. Jones is on vacation. Maybe we don't have to panic quite so much, right? So being part of the daily, be in the know, right, is super important for a well-run supply chain, especially in the actual procedural areas.
Well, and you always, knowing the people who are in your neighborhood, right? That's
exactly
what we always say. And I can speak to that because as a surgical technologist, half the United States has no clue who we are and that we are this integral part of the team that is caring for their patient on the table. And so, you talked about the fact that maybe FedEx has a delay or there's weather, but what other things can interrupt this process in the supply chain that you guys deal with on a daily basis?
So again, it's everything from hurricanes, right, all the way to, an unexpected tornado. Part of it isn't just about what's in that immediate area. It's what's going to impact the flow of trucks, trains. We may not feel the effect today or even the following day, but we may feel that effect 2 weeks later because now that original shipment is delayed coming into a distribution center. So you really have to understand when something's going to happen in the country. You have to know, are you sourcing something from that area? Or is your distribution partner sourcing something from that area? So it's really paying attention to any notifications that come out from your GPO, from your distribution partner, and being aware, because it's so easy to be, especially again, when we're in this nice warm climate, right? Where we don't have a lot of natural disasters, to be complacent. And it's actually important not to be complacent no matter where you are in the country, because anything can have a downstream effect. And it's not just about tomorrow. It's really that future order could be more at risk than what's happening today.
Yeah, eyes wide open for sure.
Right. Yeah. And that's really interesting too, because I think we do get ourselves in our little local bubble. For me, it's Selma, Alabama. And for you, it's Phoenix, Arizona. And Chris up in Tennessee. And I've forgotten the city you live in.
Well, I'm never in it anyway, so it doesn't actually matter.
But all that being said, we forget how interconnected and networked I think all of our hospitals and our health systems are. But you made me think of a very recent example. Let's think about the bridge collapse recently that happened. Obviously, that very severely affected those local hospitals and people in that area. But what about farther out than that? What about other health systems or distribution centers and other people around the country? Could that also have affected them as well? And were you paying attention to that to see if you were going to be affected?
Exactly. And I think that's where again, that relationship that you have with your GPO is really important because they're also on top of those things. They're on top of recalls. They're on top of what's happening. So they should be your first line to know right away if you could be impacted based on the travel route, or do they have to go somewhere different? And I think that especially through COVID, when we all had so much surplus, now we're doing almost the opposite. We're trying to get back to that more controlled 2 weeks on hand. And that's where you can start to get into a little bit of trouble, right? Whether it's mesh, your high dollar products, valves, whatever it might be, all of a sudden you could be realizing that you may have a delay coming up. And again, that's why the communication with the department, we talked about this on that last episode, we have to be in constant communication. We have to understand the schedules, what's coming up. Do you have potentially a special day plan because maybe you're going to be training another hospital on a product, right? I mean, there's all kinds of things that could be happening in the department. And if you're not having those routine meetings and reviews with them, that's where you might get caught 2 days out with them in a panic situation and you can't respond.
Well, and you know what else I was thinking about in their medical field, so many of the things that we use, they have expiration dates, and that matters. And these are high dollar products. And if you don't time that inventory correctly, that's a lot of money that could go to waste because they expired. And it could have been a timing on the shipping and delivery. And the logistics of it is making my head spin, and I don't do this job. So I can imagine what you all are doing. There was another aspect of it because during COVID, I remember the mask shortage and the PPE shortage. And there were those questions about, are we getting items from the United States or are we getting items from overseas? What does that experience look like? Are there so many of the items that we were getting from international sources? And how did you navigate international sources versus domestic sources? And what did all of that look like even during COVID?
Yeah. And the reality before COVID, honestly, it was us and our distribution partner, right? But even the distribution partners during COVID went to zero. And then all of a sudden we were required to source in many different fashions. And goodness knows there's a lot of companies that came out of the woodwork to quite honestly make a profit during COVID, which was rather disturbing. And I worked really hard to try not to give them money. But it really, I mean, I remember placing orders that I knew I wasn't going to get for 4 months. So then it was like, how do I survive during this 4-month period, knowing that this is coming? And then there were times, too, that what showed up wasn't quite what we expected. I will never forget. Literally, I got rain ponchos. My ICU people were like, you're joking, right? And I'm like,
oh, my God.
I still have a picture of it.
What had you ordered?
They were, well, it was supposed to be a PPE gown, but it literally looked like a rain poncho. And then they had fun with it. They were bright yellow, purple, had designs on them. And I was just like,
oh my God, that's a TikTok video in the making.
Oh Lord, it was. Oh, I'm glad I don't have to deal with that. But I mean, we were really having to react so quickly. But even now, like I said, you have to really understand what you have on hand, and again, be looking out. Is your flu season coming up? Is it? For us here in Arizona, when are our winter visitors coming back? And that even fluctuates because quite honestly, if there's an election in the northern states, right, like this year being a presidential year, those winter visitors are going to hold off to come down to Arizona until after the election. And then we're going to see a big increase in mid-November, where it's usually mid-October, things like that. I mean, you've got to be really conscious of what changes the patient demographic. And like we get really heavy on hips and knees, like us and Florida, because there's a lot of Canadians that come down to us in the winter, and that's when they're doing those procedures versus doing them up in Canada. So, I mean, there's a lot of things to think about. And I think it just comes back to that active communication, knowing your environment, knowing what you have, and then being strategic when you have to be, and having a really good relationship with your primary distribution partner.
Okay, so I'm glad you actually brought up your distribution partner, because I have a follow-on question to that. Because my understanding of the way larger health systems have their supplies, you have what you have in the hospital, and then these big hospitals or health systems also have their own warehouses where things are delivered, and their stuff is pulled from the warehouse to the hospital, and then your supplier is usually stocking that warehouse that then, and it moves supplies through. At least that's my understanding. Please correct me if I'm wrong. But, you have that warehouse full of supplies that is for your health system. But what happens if there is, say, something like Hurricane Katrina, or something like a wildfire on the West Coast, or a nasty wind storm that goes through the Midwest that knocks everything out, and suddenly those hospital systems are needing supplies, and you've got a warehouse full? Does your distribution partner ever come and say, hey, can we divert some of this back to the people who need it and we'll fill you up later? Or is there any type of give and take to make sure that other areas of the country can have what they need if they are hit with a disaster?
I believe that would 100% happen. Have I personally been the subject of that? No. I mean, there definitely during COVID locally, we would share when needed. I mean, if we were really in a situation where we couldn't get something, 100% I was asking for assistance from another healthcare system. And you can pay back and keep track of that. I think all of us have the same passion in mind as far as taking care of our patients. And, regardless of the level of competition that can happen between healthcare systems or even distribution partners, right? Because there can be multiple depending on the size of the city. I think at the end of the day, we're going to take care of the patients that we need to take care of. So I think people would 100% come together. The other thing to think about is, again, we got very strategic about wanting to have 60 or 90 days on hand. Then we got to a point when you're seeing some of that expire, right? I mean,
Right.
At N95 mask, that you bought in 2022 have a 4-year shelf life, right? They're going to start expiring in 2026. Yeah. There's a time when you have to be brave enough to go ahead and let some of that go and not hold on to so much.
Which is scary.
And COVID kind of changed that for all of us. And we're all like, are we going to have toilet paper? Like, do I need to, are the shelves going to be empty again? And I realized toilet paper is, just a small example, but we all know the toilet paper issue of the COVID years.
Oh my gosh, that was
it makes the point. But that, to go back down to a more limited supply when you went through the not having for all that time, I can see how that would be scary.
And again, it's about finding that balance, right? And having that communication and understanding demand, and that commitment with your vendor partner that they are going to have things available for you. Because again, there's a difference between a primary distribution partner where you're getting 90% of your warehouse supplies from that party to somebody that you're ordering something from twice a month. I mean, when we're in that partnership, we do rely on them. And then again, our GPO relationships and just planning and communication. And the best run supply chains are the ones who are in constant communication with their procedural areas in a proactive fashion versus waiting for them to come to you saying, we have a problem now. And expecting you to fix it on Friday at 3 p.m., because we all know I call it the Friday fire drill.
You have magical skills, Susie. You can fix it.
So let's talk about your magical skills and maybe somebody who's not communicating effectively, right? Because we owe our people, and I can talk about this, right? So sometimes people, when they don't get what they want when they want it, right? And surgeons, they tend to maybe not communicate well, and they may take it out on the person that they feel is responsible, right? So how do you handle those moments where maybe you are kind of the punching bag when somebody doesn't have exactly the stapler that they may want at that particular time, date, and moment? How does that work?
I think that I have the gift of de-escalation, and And I am willing to stand there and let them express their unhappiness, as long as it's somewhat respectful, right?
Sure.
As long as they're somewhat respectful, I will, and I have said, you will not speak to me that way.
Good.
As a director or a human, I'm not going to let you speak to me that way. So we can have a conversation about this, and I can explain the why. And then we honestly just talk about it. And usually, if you have a valid reason, then you can get through that conversation, because at first they're just, something didn't happen the way they expected. We all get disappointed by that. I will say it is a much different conversation if we really did something wrong. Like if it was that honestly we had a mistake and we missed something, you fess up to it and you give them the plan, your action plan of how you're going to avoid that in the future. And sometimes that is all you need to do to de-escalate the situation. Now, what's more frustrating is when they leapfrog me and they go all the way to the CEO, and then the CEO is asking me about the supply shortage. And I'm like, you realize
whoa.
You have an email about this, right? I've already warned you that you were going to hear from so-and-so. Again, that's even that, being able to know what's happening and then communicate back to the senior leadership of the hospital, because there are oftentimes you're going to get leapfrogged and they're going to go directly to the senior leadership. So it's also about communicating with that team and ensuring that they know something. And a lot of times, every single time I get a FedEx alert about weather in Memphis, and a lot of people don't understand just how much that hub is. I mean, there are things that can leave Utah, go to Memphis, and come back to Phoenix, right?
Really?
It's not logical. Absolutely. It's not logical, but it's how it works. So whenever I see something happening in Memphis, I immediately warn people ahead. Just be on the alert. Will it happen? Maybe not. But I send that out consistently. And you have to, because we have to understand that, again, things that happen outside of our state or our immediate area could impact the actual transportation of it.
Right. And so that the communication and the communication topic, I think, is so relevant to the rest of this conversation, because your awareness of what's going on around the country, because your shipping hubs, where things are coming in from, and so who might be affected, and that would then down the line affect you and your facility. But then also having those relationships between your other department heads, obviously your director of surgical services, your sterile processing director, your OR director, and then obviously other parts of the hospital too, because while we think the OR is amazing, we actually aren't the only department in the hospital. And you have to navigate every supply room, every department. And so how do you, when there is something that happens that is significant, that is, is going to affect your hospital, what process do you go through to get the word out to your department heads so that they know it's coming and so that they can also be prepared for whatever supply availability you might run into?
One, obviously email is always important, but we also know not everybody reads email. So a lot of hospitals, and I would say most hospitals, have some type of safety huddle. So something like that I'm going to bring up on a safety huddle as well. And then quite honestly, it's got to come back to that one-on-one communication. We also don't want to scare people if it isn't necessary, right?
Sure.
So there's got to be that awareness at our level, and then understanding what do we have on hand, what is the risk, and then when is it right to communicate? Because if we're working on a sub, if we're working on another option, maybe we give them a slight heads up, but say we're working on it and then we're going to follow back up with you. It's a fine line between panicking them and being able to come to them with, this is happening, but here's our solution. And honestly, sometimes it's going to be a day of the week thing, right? Something that happens on a Thursday is going to have a different impact because of the weekend compared to something that happens on a Tuesday, and we might be able to resolve it before the weekend. Again, one of our challenges here in Arizona is things that we usually can get overnight. There are certain products that, because of the heat in Arizona, they won't ship it on a Friday overnight because it's going to sit in a warehouse over the weekend, right?
Oh,
So
and it
things
can
that
melt.
are right, things that
Yeah.
are refrigerated. So certain things will be, if we find out about it on Friday and the doctor wants to do the case on Monday, sometimes we have to say no because we physically cannot get the vendor to get it to us. They won't ship it until Monday for Tuesday. And I've had physicians get frustrated about that, but it is like saphenous veins, things like that. They're just not going to do it because of the heat. So that impacts us in the summer. I mean, there's just so many caveats to what we do and where we are that, again, it's about communication and understanding. But I think that if you're constantly having to answer questions and put out fires, you probably need to be focusing more on your communication ahead of time. That
Well, and
should
your
be
process,
a clue, right? So,
Yeah.
or if you're constantly having, unfortunately, a department director going to the C-suite complaining about issues, that supply chain department probably needs to think about their communication process differently.
I have a crazy question. And
Okay, I love those.
So do supply chain departments, do y'all have on-call folks? Because, crazy things never happen Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, right?
Right.
Like somebody's going to hit a bridge in the middle of the night, or a bomb's going to go off on
Right.
Saturday at 2 a.m. or something. Like, how do y'all handle that? Is there somebody that's watching CNN at 2 a.m. on Saturday? Seriously, like,
it's
how does
the
that happen?
department. It's going to be the department director, and especially, I mean, obviously, everybody has emergency plans that go into effect, right? So the supply chain leader in a hospital is always going to be part of that emergency operations plan because they have to be, because anything's going to impact supplies, right? So they're always part of that. So especially if it's something local, they're going to get some type of notification from their hospital system that something's happening, and they would get triggered pretty darn quick. So that happens, and we all do, worst case scenario planning, even between the other hospitals, if we were to not have the supplies available to take care of something in a natural disaster, there's already a plan in the background where we would have an agreement to do transfers to another hospital system. So all hospitals practice those scenarios in the background, and it doesn't always get down to the level of the worker bees, but the department directors are practicing that stuff and thinking about that stuff on a routine basis. I would say probably in every hospital system, we have to.
Yeah, and we actually heard that earlier in the season with another person that we interviewed. They talked about how when there is a large scale emergency, something that's going to affect the entire area, suddenly it's not about the competition between the hospitals. It's not about me versus you. It's about saving the lives of the people in our community, and we are united in that effort. And they talked about having those plans in place to share supplies. Who would we divert to? Who goes where, so that we can work together? And then when the disaster's over, we'll go back to being competitors. But for now, we're going to take care of our community.
Yep. And I mean, when you have those sessions, and again, it is serious to think about that, right? It's the reason even in our own homes why we teach our kids where to go in a fire, right? You've got to be prepared. You've got to at least have it in the back of your mind. What would I do? And I mean, we're on the phone with pretend scenarios with other hospitals. So we're all engaged in that. And associations like AORN, ARM, all of these associations, at the end of the day, we're all going to those conferences together. We are all one in the same passion to take care of patients. So I think any of us would let that go if we had to help somebody else.
Totally. Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. So we have come to the end of this conversation entirely too quickly. But before we completely wrap, because not only will we wrap this conversation, we're going to wrap this season. So no pressure on you at all, Suzi.
None, right?
But do you have any other final thoughts, any other thing you want to share with our audience before we wrap this up?
I think my biggest advice to supply chain department leaders out there, regardless of the size of your hospital, is honestly, don't be afraid to get involved really intimately with your departments. Understand what they do, what are the demands as a new surgeon coming in, have the conversations. Make sure that your employees too, that you're tying that importance of being in the healthcare continuum to your employees. I hired a gal as an OR coordinator. She was awesome and, young, and I knew she was going to do a good job, but she had never seen a surgery. So before I did anything else, I had her go into a fairly basic surgery, but I had her watch so that she could understand what was happening and when things were going to be requested. And, so get involved and really be part of it, because just like we, talked about earlier, I'm not a nurse, but I've definitely, I have learned the departments, and I have learned what they do and the critical nature and why sometimes, I'll have an employee come back and say, oh my God, RT is like so, and I'm like, you realize what they went through during COVID, right? They're still a little, and
they're a little frazzled.
So I think just don't be afraid to dive in and understand the different needs and caveats of all of your departments. And especially if a new leader comes in. I think that's the other big, if you get a new OR director, get right in there with them. You should be one of the first people they're talking to.
I love that. Thank you so much, Suzi. I really appreciate you joining us on the show and helping us cap off the season with a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much, Melanie. It's so nice meeting you, Chris, and you guys just do amazing things. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Our pleasure.
That was Suzi Collins, Director of Supply Chain Analytics for Banner Health. And Chris, I don't think I have ever put that much thought into what's going on in another part of the country and how it's going to affect whether or not our supplies show up in my town. And yet it's so simple when you actually think about it, how anything can happen around the country with our interconnectedness of shipping and deliveries and everything that goes on. I mean, it can be upset in a moment. And I think Suzi really did just a really good job of not only talking about how those things are interconnected, but also how she can communicate that with her facility to make sure everybody knows what's going on if something's happening.
Absolutely. And I think throughout this entire season, the one thing that has strung every episode together is the word communication.
Oh, yeah.
And, communication is so important. We already know that in the operating room. But if there's anything that we can take away, it's that communication, regardless of what department, what health system, inside and outside the hospital, the better communicator you are, the more calmly and efficiently you can do that, the better we're going to be prepared in a disaster, regardless of what kind. And I hope everybody takes that away this season.
Absolutely. And if there's one other thing they can take away, we all know that it is not if a disaster is going to occur, it is when it occurs. And by having conversations like these and by working within our departments, we can prepare, we can be ready. So when the inevitable happens, we know how to react. And while I cannot believe it, that is going to do it for not only this episode, but also for season 12. Thank you so much, all of you, for listening in and joining us on this very educational season. And just remember, season 13 is right around the corner, and we're going to be continuing our learning with a different type of season that's going to be more like your morning huddle and talking about those topics that are relevant to us in the OR specifically, things we need to remember, things we need to learn. So don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. We're going to be right back in season 13 with even more learning. So on behalf of Chris, myself, and the whole team here at First Case, thanks for listening to this season of the First Case podcast.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to First Case on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for First Case in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@firstcasemedia.com. We look forward to hearing from you.